Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and El Camino are stories about our capacity for evil, trauma, crime, deception, and other emotionally interesting things. But Vince Gilligan and his writing teams use a very process-oriented approach to writing that focuses on the details of how characters solve problems to structure their stories and create dramatic tension. Spoilers ahead. Thank you so much to Mubi for sponsoring this video.
So, what now? How do we proceed?
Vince Gilligan structures the macro arc of his stories around a character's progression from A to B to Z. His motivation for writing El Camino shows how the details of how a character gets from one point to the next are important to Vince. In a recent interview for Rolling Stone, he said, "As I was writing the final episode of Breaking Bad, I couldn't help but wonder, where was Jesse driving to? As the months and the years progressed, I found myself daydreaming about, well, how exactly would he have gotten away? If you have Jesse at point A, escaping from the compound at the end of Breaking Bad, how do you get him to point Z? Freedom. This A to Z structure exists for each story in the world of Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad began with the simple concept of Mr. Chips becomes Scarface. Right there you have your A and your Z. The writers establish their characters at point A, and the core of the show becomes figuring out how to get the character to point Z. Better Call Saul is a prequel, which gives it a natural Z point. The pilot establishes Jimmy McGill, and the core of the show is spent showing how he gets to point Z. Obviously, having a character that goes from point A to Z is not original to Vince Gilligan, but my point here is not that the A to Z exists in the final product, but that Gilligan's approach to writing involves starting with a point A and a point Z, and then figuring out what happens in between those 2 points. It's not just this approach, but the way Gilligan focuses on the details and the process of how the characters get from one point to the next and the obstacles they face along the way that begins to set his writing apart as identifiably his.
Tell me why you're doing this. Seriously.
Why do you do it?
Money? Mainly?
There you go.
Once you have your A point and your Z point, what makes the steps from point B to C to Y interesting to the audience? Conflict is the foundation of drama, and one way to imbue a character's process with conflict is to make that process the solution to a problem. This doesn't mean that the character is necessarily trying to get to point Z. The character might be aiming for something else. In Better Call Saul, Jimmy isn't trying to become Saul Goodman, but the problems he faces and his solutions to those problems will make up the points along his path towards the final endpoint. The question of how exactly Jesse gets to Alaska is interesting because it's a difficult problem for him to solve. To do it, he's going to need money, and the details of how he acquires that money becomes the structural frame of the story. On the surface, this is actually the same frame that both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul start with. In each story, the character's need for money is the initial problem they must solve. Where they differ is how each character's individual qualities, situation, pride, and skills affect the way they approach solving this larger problem. And the question of why they choose the solutions that they do provides space for the core character development. For example, in El Camino, the Todd flashbacks reveal a lot of interesting emotional character moments about both Todd and Jesse. But the narrative motivation for these scenes is showing why Jesse looks for the money at Todd's apartment. In Breaking Bad, Walter White starts cooking meth because it's his solution to not having the money to pay for chemotherapy, but exploring why he chooses this as a solution is where the core of his character development lies. For each character, their original solution causes a cascading series of new problems that they must work to solve. This is the logic used to progress the story to the next point. Let's look at how this interlocking series of problems and solutions propels El Camino forward. Main problem: Jesse needs to escape. Subproblem 1: Jesse is driving a recognizable car. Temporary solution: hide it at Skinny Pete's house while he recovers. Permanent solution: get Old Joe to destroy the car. This uncovers a new problem.
Whoa.
The car is being tracked, but fortunately, Skinny Pete has a solution. It's not always the main character that comes up with the solution, and some of the best character moments in these shows are when Kim solves a problem for Jimmy or Jesse solves a problem for Walt. Now that sub-problem 1 has been solved for Jesse, he can tackle sub-problem 2, finding money to pay Joe the disappearer. But I think what really makes Gilligan's writing unique is not just the way he uses problems and solutions to drive what points B to Y will be, but the way he reveals those points to the audience.
Alaska. Start over. Start fresh.
In El Camino, Gilligan shows Jesse working towards the solution of finding Todd's money. But at this point, the audience doesn't know what problem Jesse is working towards solving or what solution Jesse is working towards achieving. Gilligan simply shows the details of Jesse working towards this goal and lets us piece together what's happening as it happens. This means that while the characters follow a very direct A to B to Z progression in the story, the audience may not be shown how these points relate to each other as they're happening. This is a technique used frequently throughout Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. The audience is often shown a character working towards a specific solution before what the solution is or what the problem is has been revealed. A great example of this is in the first episode of Better Call Saul Season 3, written by Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould. In this episode, we get a 6-minute scene of Mike searching for a tracker on his car, but the audience is never told what he's doing. Once he finds it, we get another scene showing his process to drain the battery on the tracker and replace it, but again, none of this is explained through exposition, and why he's doing it isn't clear until we see the result at the end of the episode. The sense of discovery you have once you eventually piece together on your own how B related to C and C related to D, and realize what the character has been doing this entire time is one of my favorite things about watching Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul. Once Jesse finds the money in Todd's apartment, another problem crops up that he has to deal with.
Three-way split, and you got your third.
Jesse doesn't get all the money, and so the money isn't working as a solution.
8,200. 8,200.
Now he has to deal with the problem of going back to get more money from the welder.
That three-way split didn't quite cover it for me.
But when he does this, he faces the problem of winning a gunfight to get the money.
You're 22 against my 45. Winner takes all.
But Gilligan doesn't spell out any of these problems or solutions to the audience. So when he shows Jesse working to acquire the guns for the showdown, Gilligan doesn't reveal that Jesse intends to return and get more of the money, or tell us how Jesse intends to pull this off. He just shows Jesse calling his parents, which we then realize is a distraction so he can find the key to the house, sneak inside, open the safe, and find the guns which he uses to win the gunfight. We're shown the solution to the problem of winning a gunfight before we know winning a gunfight is the problem that will need to be solved. When it happens, you have the aha moment of realizing what the problem was that the character was working towards earlier and realizing how they solved that problem. In addition to not making it immediately clear how one point relates to the next, Gilligan often reveals to the audience these points out of order. This nonlinear approach is a central aspect of Gilligan's storytelling, and it's been around since the first scene of Breaking Bad, where we see Walt trying to escape from a meth cook gone wrong, but the audience doesn't yet know that he was cooking meth or why. We're shown the Z for that episode first, and the rest of that episode is spent back solving to get us to that moment. We see this again in the final season, where the first scene of the season reveals Walt working to solve a problem that won't crop up until the finale 16 episodes later. Often while I'm watching a character in one of these shows work, I think, what are they up to? Wanting to find out the answer to that question draws me in, makes me pay closer attention, and keeps me hooked. And it's a big part of why Gilligan's focus on characters' process and the details of work stays interesting. And this isn't to say that this is all that's going on in these stories dramatically. Obviously, throughout the shows, this technique isn't always used, and sometimes process or a problem and its solution are laid out in a much more straightforward way. In these stories, there's inter-character conflict and action that also creates drama and excitement, but in the world of Breaking Bad, I think much of the drama is supported by the structural skeleton of Vince Gilligan wanting to know, how exactly does a character get from point A to B, and finally to Z. Essential Killing is another movie that follows a man on an escape in a very procedural A to B to Z way. It even uses flashbacks and flash forwards in a manner similar to El Camino to deal with trauma. Essential Killing is one of the 30 films available on Mubi right now. Every day they add a new indie, art house, international, cult hit, or classic masterpiece. If you want to discover interesting films of all types and sizes, this is the service you need to be a part of. You can get your extended free trial when you go to mubi.com/ThomasFlight. That's mubi.com/ThomasFlight for your free 30-day trial of Mubi. Thanks again to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Thank you for watching. Thanks so much to my patron supporters. I want to quickly plug a new podcast I started with Jackson from Skip Intro. In episode 2 of the show, we both review and discuss El Camino and talk about what its presence on Netflix says about streaming services and how the lines between TV and movies are starting to blur. Check it out and subscribe at streamtheorypodcast.com.